So good evening. Welcome to the Bradford County Historical Society and Friday night at the museum. And just a reminder that the museum is open Wednesday through Friday 10 to 4 and the first Saturday of the month 10 to 2. And feel free to come in. Tom, our tour guide, will give you a tour, and Denise will help you up in the research library. This is our second program for Friday night at the museum this year. And this was scheduled for last year, actually, but I went and got COVID. So we ended up having to cancel it. So we're back again this year, so I appreciate Chip coming back and doing this again. So this evening's program is called Growing Up in Stevensville, based on the book done by Richard Schuster, who is our speaker this evening. So he will come at this time. Thank you, sir.
Hello. Let me see if we can. I had a colleague about 30 years ago when I was working for the Army, and he liked to go to the officers club and have supper, and I was doing the SAR presentation on the leadership of the personalities of our Revolutionary War leaders. And he got into it after he probably had his third Manhattan, and he got into the back of the room and he looked up and he saw me and he says, "Oh damn, it's Chip Schuster and another one of those academic presentations of his." So I will try not to do that, although my 3 children do keep me at bay because they're afraid that I will do those academic presentations with my 4 grandchildren. But what I want to do is talk to you about how we try, and this is my wacky idea in life, is to keep people alive by actually sitting down and recording their histories. That's the way we keep people alive. Because what happens too often, and if you've seen this with Henry Louis Gates and PBS, where they have all these celebrities on, and they don't know anything beyond their grandparents as to where they came from, what they did, and all that. And so my effort in the world is to, and why I wrote this book, is to keep people alive, and these were very good people to keep alive. The book became problematic in the sense that I had so many people help me. And one of the things which I centered on was my mother's life, all the stories that she would tell, but she never told anybody else because she was just a very quiet lady. And I decided that I was going to tell all the stories, good, bad, and indifferent. And I worried about this. But the first part of the book is my mother's life, the early history by Madeline Stevens of the Stevens families, a whole section on just sections of the families that were in Stevensville originally from this time frame of 1791 to 1956. And then there was a part of maps, roads, and bridges that I tried to bring in, and references. We doing okay? Okay. Okay. And then, and I did the references. I used in my dissertation APA form, and of course sometimes it doesn't work very well with Microsoft Word and spell check. So it's been an adventure, but I wanted to let you know that everything that's in this book has a reference to it. Okay? And then finally the photo gallery, which just about drove me nuts. I mean, you know, just tear my hair out. So that was kind of it. So it was my mother's view, but it really came from my grandmother. Now, how many of you are from the Towanda area? Okay. My first memory as a child was in this town. My grandmother, who was hell on wheels, it was Margaret Casson Fassett, and she was in a nursing home just down the street about 7 blocks on North Main. And it was right near where Chestnut meets North Main, if you know that spot. And I was 3 years old, just turned 3, and I was basically in my mom's arms going in to meet my grandmother, who was basically dying in the nursing home. The irony is that the nursing home was one of her DAR buddies' home originally. So she's sitting there in a home that was once her friend, and now she's there. And she had just was complaining to the nursing staff about how heavy the covers were. And so I come in there, and I somehow get out of my mother's grasp and get on her bed. And I'm running around her legs and everything else, just having this great time, which she is absolutely enjoying after she's absolutely cussed out the whole nursing staff. And it was my first memory as a child, was being with her. And I don't want to get too emotional about this, but I think at that time, my fate was passed from her to me, because she wrote much of this about Stevensville and genealogy and all the sorts of contents. And I think it just got transferred to me, and I became a history major in college, and that's how beginning. But I want to bring that up in the fact that that's where we came from. Now, I got a couple other questions. See, I do questions. How many of you have ever had a Myers-Briggs temperament inventory test? A few of you. Okay, you remember your types? Probably not. ESTJ. Right. Any rate, one of the things that I did in this book is when I wrote in the book, I actually started to describe the people with their personalities. I didn't call them Myers-Briggs, but I tried to do that. And it just gives you another glimpse into who they were and what their personalities were. And I thought that that would be something that you would like to do. I remember that there are the 4 types, and the easiest way to explain it is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you know the Gospels. Well, these 4 types pretty much fit into that. They have a new thing out called an emogram, and it's pretty close to that. But that's built into this. I always liked to, when I was with the Army, the essential judgmentals after the general spoke were up in the office, but the intuitive feelers were out in the parking lot talking about the whole thing. And I just got very curious in life about why people behave the way they do. And so that's kind of built into the book as another reason that I got that going. I do come from an organizational behavior background, and that's basically what I taught, organizational behavior and human effectiveness. And so, I get just very curious about those sorts of things. All right, one of the things that I got Agatha Christie, let's see if we can, she's down here. And Agatha always said that everything happens in a small town, and in Stevensville case, everything did happen in a small town. And the book is a classic example of that. And there's something called humor in humility. 2 questions. Who are these people? And the questions were answered by the fact that I inherited my Maggie Cassins and my grandfather, Fred Fassett. I inherited their diaries. And going through the diaries was one of the holdups in this book, because there was so much in the diaries that I ended up publishing a first book. Not the book, I published the first book of all the summaries of the diaries. And I did that because I had to, again, part of it was doing the historical references to make sure I had the references right. And so I had to use this first book on all the diary summaries to make sure that I got the right dates, the right times, and the right people. And that it was an enormous project which resulted in a delay in me getting this book done. So it's been an adventure along that line. The second thing, and we have Joe Jones here. Joe, just raise your hand. Good. Everybody kind of got excited about this and in Stevensville, and so there was a lady named Blendina Sumner McGee. And Blendina Sumner McGee was absolutely a wonderful, interesting person, a special person. A lot of people called her Aunt Dina. She never had children of her own, but she wrote down her own diaries. And I have to thank Joe because Joe got me. I didn't want to do it at first. I didn't want to do the diaries for Blendina. But then Joe kind of convinced me, and then Joe took me over to Pat Carr, who had Blendina's diaries. And it was a moment where I had to do, believe it or not, a second summary of all of Blendina's diaries. And I did this up until 1956. So, as you can see, this has been a long and winding road with just trying to get this right for the people that lived in Stevensville, to just do it the right way. And so I had that from her. The striking thing is doing when I decided to do everything that I knew that my mother would not put in her genealogies because she was a lady, I always got a fear that I might be run out of town after I did this book. And that was a kind of a major concern, because I think if you read the book, you'll find that there are some controversial issues in that book, even involving Towanda, and I won't go further than that. So that got to be a concern, but another friend of mine over in Stevensville, Cheryl Beth Balcom, she said, well, Chipper, it's history, and you can't argue with history, so go ahead and write everything. So that was a big decision, because there were some issues that were controversial. Let's see if we can. So that's the Balcom Manifesto. I will try and get through this as best I can, but what's happened to me over the years is I've gotten to know these people so well that I sometimes get emotional about the stories. So just bear with me. The one story, and it has two versions in the book, is about the Divine brothers, who were best friends with Eddie and, excuse me, with Eddie Goodwin. And it seemed that there was a situation where they were in battle, and Eddie got shot in the foot. And they took him to a hospital, a military hospital, and the Divine boys went over to see him, and it wasn't a pretty sight in the Civil War in a hospital. And what they did is they basically saved his life by each night, one of them would take one of their boots off and fill it with food and go over to see Eddie and feed him. And the Divines rode home, and basically they told the situation with Eddie in the military hospital, and the Stevensville people made a collection, and they sent their family doctor to the hospital to help save Eddie. And then Eddie came back, and he had, this was through his niece, he had a situation where he had PTSD. And he wasn't he lived a long life, but he never forgot his situation in the hospital. And that strikes me as something that's a story that tells you something about the people in Stevensville at the time, that they really cared for their people. So you have that situation. There was another individual, Richard France. Richard never graduated from high school. He was drafted before he could graduate from high school, and the France family was a wonderful family, good parents. And so he was sent overseas in the Army. And he was in the Hurricane Forest and didn't make it out alive. And I don't know if you know Jay Chadwick, maybe some of you do, but Jay's father was Jim Chadwick, and Jim was so concerned about this situation that, that all his life he went over to the Camptown Cemetery and he gave him flowers every Memorial Day. And that tells you something about people in Stevensville and something about the people of this age, and it's something that I felt was important in the book. Now, getting a little lighthearted here, there's an individual in town. My mother always said that there are ghost houses in town, and she would point them out to me. Now, this was a refined lady that absolutely would be the last person to believe in ghosts, okay? But I later ran into a situation in the process of doing this book where somebody in Stevensville had a vision with somebody showing up in their bed, and they were in a Civil War uniform, and I was able to identify who that person was. And so one of the things that I think is very important is if you have an old house, you better be careful, because there may be some ghosts and spirits, and you better treat that house correctly, okay? Or you may be in big trouble. You may have visitors in the night with that story. So you get a little glimpse of where we are. The final person is Wallace Byron Bates. I don't know if you're familiar, anybody familiar with the Bates family? And right, okay. Bill and Addie Bates, and Bill Bates worked with my grandfather ran the country store in Stevensville from 1902 till 1946, a lot of years. And he did a lot of other things. His right-hand person was Bill Bates. And Bill Bates, the Bateses, he had a love affair with Addie Bates, his wife, for many years. They had 8 boys. And I'm going to name them for you: William, Walter, Wellen, Willard, Winfred, Wendell, Wyndon, and then Wallace. And Wallace was named for my great-grandfather, Wallace Fassett. At any rate, Wallace joined the Marines, and he was on Guadalcanal, and he came back dead. And that's sort of a special place where I tend to go to in the cemetery in Stevensville. And so in the book, we have those sorts of situations of people that gave their lives for this country. And I thought that that was a special thing to include. The other thing that just took me away after I go through this book is barns and babies. If there's one threat in Stevensville, it just shocked me going through and doing the research, is how many babies died. We have a medical system that sometimes in this country that can be difficult, okay? But we don't have the baby deaths that we had at that time. It was just shocking after baby after baby after baby died. And it just was there. The other danger in this world, and it was in Stevensville, was the fact that barns burned down and people lost everything. And we were, at that time, very much an agricultural society. And what would happen is the barn would get hit by lightning and just burn down. The cattle would be lost, whatever was in the barn would be lost, and people would have to start over again. It was just two things that just, kind of hit me in the heart that I thought should be discussed, and how difficult times were with that. The other issue is alcohol. Maggie Casson Fassett was an anti-salooner, and she was also a suffragette. So she would just do her stuff. She was an interesting individual because, like I said, my grandfather was running the country store, and Mannequin was trying to run everybody else's life. Anyway, so the Presbyterian church in town was anti-saloon, and this was a heck of an issue, that there was going to be no drink, no nothing. However, at the time in Stevensville, and Bob Kimmel's here. Bob, raise your hand because he takes care of the Episcopal Church in Stevensville, was just a little bit out of town in St. Matthews. And then up on Divine Road, they had a little shack up there where after they went to service, they went up and they had a little bit of booze after service, and they were sort of the antithesis of all this. And it was really interesting that they had this going on. And again, I have to thank Joe for helping me along with this. But it seems that there was Frank Estabrook had the Grants were in Stevensville. In fact, W.T. Grant was actually born in Stevensville, and he ran Grant stores for many years. And the Grants had basically, they were in Stevensville, and then they went away for 20 years, and the leading person in town was Frank Estabrook, who was the richest person in town, had the first Ford car, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it just so happened that in the Grant house had a basement. And in the basement, they had this thing called the Fountain House. And in the Fountain House, you could get a drink in Stevensville, but you had to. So for years, this went on where you had this very anti-alcohol church, but then you could go and find a place to get a drink. And it was really a remarkable thing to do that. And this actually got into the fact that there's a story in the book when my grandparents sold the country store and moved to Wyalusing. And when they moved to Wyalusing, of course, my grandmother was still anti-alcohol. But every night, my grandfather would go down and he would have to check the coal bin and make sure everything down in the coal bin was all wonderful and good. Well, lo and behold, in the coal bin was a nice bottle of wine. So he would have his shot of wine every night. And my grandmother would always go, "Oh my goodness, why does he go down there every night?" And he always would crack a nut. And he would crack the nut so that it would hide the alcohol taste, so then he would come back upstairs. Well, one day, my mother was visiting in the Wyalusing house, and they were all sitting over there, and they were, kind of getting old, and my grandmother announced to my grandfather that she had had somebody clean out the coal bin. And my mother always said that the fastest she ever saw my grandfather move was when he went down to see if this bottle of wine was still there and wanted to hide it again. And in my mother's old age, and since the book was kind of about her, my mother's old age is my mother would have a drink of Budweiser every night. Every night she'd have a drink of Budweiser. But what was funny about it is that she would hide the cans every night because she still had this fear that my grandmother was going to still find that she had had a beer. So this was absolutely one of the big issues in Stevensville. And I don't know how it is for the rest of you and where you're from, but this was really the crucial thing. So I had to bring that up. The interesting thing about that there was a character named Elwyn Edwards. And Elwyn Edwards, I don't know if you've ever, you're a little older, so you might remember the Locust Inn, which was just outside of Stevensville. And there was this whole stink about Elwyn Edwards starting this bar called the Locust Inn. Well, it seems that the good church people in the Presbyterian Church had not done their homework. They were, as Wednesday Addams and Addams Family Values goes, they were sloppy. And so Elwyn was kind of a character. And he did some research, and he found out that there was never a county law set for Stevensville that said you could not have alcohol in the township. So he came down here and he got a liquor license, and ran this bar for many years. And he, stopped the farming business, and he had a good thing. So the part of this that's fascinating to me is how inventive Stevensville people could be. And it's country logic. And you do a little homework and you get what you want in life. So that was it. So you have the triple play of Frank, Fred, and Elwyn. My grandparents were third cousins. And you have to understand that if you start to do genealogy around here, you're going to have some situations where people are related to other people. And they couldn't be more different. They were third cousins, but the Cassons all went off to war and just did that. But over on the Fassett side, my great-great-grandmother was a Quaker. And so you had a situation where they would argue all the time. They couldn't be different. I'm going to digress and tell you that my grandmother would just raise hell with my grandfather. And they would kind of do this, and I'm digressing a little bit here, but they would kind of do this. And one day she just was pouring it on to him it was always about church and what the pastors were doing. And of course, my grandfather taught Sunday school. But one of the things that's interesting over in Forkston, where they were from, was that the Addams family, there were two Addams families in the Forkston area. And one is the Henry Addams family that was related to the president and all that. But the other one were questionable. They weren't bad people, but they were actually quite clever, but they were always considered a little bit nutty. And so they had this fight one night, and finally my grandfather just said he wasn't going to take it anymore, and he says, "Well, you may not like my Fassett family, but I don't have Adam's blood in your genes and you do." And it shut her up. So, history, I guess the point as a history major is history needs to be fun, okay? And so hopefully I've done this book with a little bit of fun, even though we talk about soldiers and Quakers. On another side of this is, believe it or not, Stevensville is really connected to Spring Hill. Now, I don't know if you know anything about Spring Hill. And for years, my mother would always talk about Helen Wells and Teddy. Helen Wells and Teddy got to be a thing. And she would just talk about them, but when you're doing history, sometimes silence says a lot. And with my mother, she never mentioned anything other than Helen Wells and Teddy and how they were. And it so happens that if you go by this Spring Hill Cemetery, you see Helen's grave and you see Teddy's grave. Teddy was feeling good one day, got sick the next, and was dead the third day. He was only 10. Helen lasted a little bit longer, and the story is Dr. Guthrie came in the night to try and save Helen, but she had what was pneumonia, and she died when Dr. Guthrie got there. Now, there's something about Dr. Guthrie that was pretty special in this county. If he would go in the middle of the night to try and save somebody's life, he would do it. And this is the one part of the book that has that part, has that mention of Dr. Guthrie, and I thought that was kind of important. But, you know, my mother would never talk about it because she lost her two friends at such an early age. It was just, so sometimes in history you find when you have something going on and then it drops off the face of the earth, it never gets discussed again, it's because it's too painful. So that's, and I have Aunt Dina Sumner McGee in there because she is also buried in that cemetery. So sometimes I have a little difficulty when I go by up to Spring Hill and I go by that cemetery and I think about that. All right. I do want to, before I get into the conclusion here, I'm sure you're ready for me to go, but I do want to mention two things. There are two things in the book that are not quite in place. And one is the pig lady, and I have Bob Kimmel here to thank me to help me through the pig lady. And I don't know, because the pig lady was in a time frame that was much later than 1956. So the pig lady has been an interesting story, and I, in fairness to the pig lady, I did not name her name.
She was a very good son.
Yeah, 47 pigs in one house.
I sold them a tractor, and of course it's right across from what used to be the grist mill.
Yes.
And so I went in the home to get the paperwork all done. And I'm telling you, I've never seen so many pigs in my life. Yet it was a clean house.
Well,
Unbelievable.
the part I like with the pig lady was the sheriff came to Stevensville to have a big meeting about what to do about the pig lady. And he was trying to do his best to explain this situation. And somebody raised their hand and said, "Sheriff, if you don't do something about this problem, we're going to have the biggest barbecue in the history of Stevensville." So, at any rate, the other thing is the $1 Million Dog. And I won't go into this except that it is a true story, and I had to put it in the book because it was just too good not to put into the book. But I did a little licensing that it might be not quite referenced appropriately, but it is a true story. So I have that in. The enemy of doing this, I want to talk about doing one of these books. The enemy is perfection. We have so many things we do with Word and check, and again, I come out of the APA field of doing academic journals and dissertations in an APA style, which doesn't fit into Microsoft Word. So, you know, after a while, you just gotta get off the can and you gotta publish the thing. And that is something to keep in mind, that you're not going to actually have perfection. So if some of you have bought the book, if there's a typo or something that isn't quite, I apologize. But I had to get the thing done because I was afraid I was going to die before I get this thing done. Just went on and on and on, and it went on and on for good reason. It went on and on because I had help, and I had people giving me photos and doing all sorts of wonderful things. So that's one of the factors. So I've got that full speed ahead, and then I want to talk about local history, because this is something that I'm trying to preach to you, to write things down. I'll try and read this. J.H. Plum wrote, "Perhaps the greatest pleasure of local history is its intimacy. It brings one face to face with ordinary men and women who once walked the streets we walk and are now dead and almost forgotten. Their letters and thoughts have poignancy that is rarely matched. They express the hopes, fears, affection, love, wants, despair. In them our common humanity is bared. Written without a thought of posterity, they review the human character as sharp as any novel." And that's why local history is important. And the thing I want to bring to you today that I truly believe is to write things down. Write things down, get it into a form. If you can give it to your children or grandchildren so they can publish it, but write about these people. Keep them alive. Let's not be, again, Henry Louis Gates, where some person gets in there and they absolutely don't know anything about anything back between their grandparents on genealogy side, but they've lost all the family stories. And what I've tried to do is fight that and have the family stories. Let's see if I got one more here. Write it down. I want to thank you for your patience and helping me get through this. I had a little emotion here because these things are important to me, and I hope you've enjoyed this. And the book is a fundraiser for the museums. I didn't need the money, so I basically have done that, and some of you have bought those books. And if you have people that will, give money for both the Wyalusing Valley Museum and here, please do so. I'll take any questions. Uh-oh, there are no questions. I do want to mention one other thing. I do presentations on, again, Myers-Briggs and leadership, and use film sometimes to discuss those sorts of things. And I'm always willing, if I'm available, because I usually try and spend most of my summers here. I usually take a break in July and go back to South Carolina where I roast. But if I can do a presentation for one of your organizations, sometimes maybe DAR, SAR, I'd be happy to discuss that with you. You at least get a flavor for how I present. And I want to thank you. Questions? Nothing? Bueller? All right. Have a good evening. Stay safe.